Hey everyone, it's Darren. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about another election topic, and this is a US specific election topic, and that is the Electoral College. Before we start, I want to make clear that I have my political views, you have your political views. They may or may not match, but on this video, we're not paying any attention to that stuff. All we're looking at is the math. We're looking at statistical factors, we're looking at mathematical factors. We're not looking at, this party should win, that party should win, whatever. Just the math. Please also respect that down in the comments if you might make comments on this. Uh, so let's go ahead and start. First, what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is a system that used to be a little more common around the world. And what that is each state in the country is allocated a certain number of Electoral College votes. The number of votes each state receives is one for each senator and one for each member of the House of Representatives. So every state gets two automatically for each senator, and they get one minimum for House of Representatives. Every state has at least one House representative. House representatives are allocated by population, but everyone gets at least one. And this ends up creating some disparity between big states and small states. And before we go into exactly how much there is and what the impact can be, let's look at what impact this has had in the past. And if you look on the screen here, there have been three cases in history, and two of them pretty recently, where the Electoral College winner and the popular vote winner did not match. Uh, in 1888, Benjamin Harrison won the electoral vote, uh, but did not win the popular vote. He lost it by 90,000, by over 90,000, and was elected president. In 2000, George W. Bush lost the popular vote by more than a half million. Won the electoral vote kind of 271 to 266. Um, if you don't remember that election, if you were around at the time, you remember it. If you don't remember it, there were some issues in Florida, and the Supreme Court ended up pretty much deciding the election rather than the actual votes. Then in 2016, Donald Trump lost the election by more than 2.8 million votes, but won the electoral vote 304 to 277, and he became president. Uh, so we have this idea that the person who gets the most votes wins, and that's usually the case, except with the Electoral College. And that's where things can sometimes be a little messy. So let's look a little bit more into what the Electoral College actually is. So when the Constitution was first set up, there were big states and there were small states. And the small states were scared. They were afraid that the big states would overpower them, would take over, and just completely ignore everything they wanted, all the needs of the small states. And this kind of created a compromise, and there's a couple of big factors that are in use every day today. The first one was that the while the House was allocated based purely on population, the Senate was allocated two per state, regardless of population. So a state has 10 times more people, they still only get two senators. Uh, Now, that does mean that the uh, senators, that each person living in a small state that has a tenth of the population of the big state does get 10 times more representation than someone living in a big state. Uh, the Electoral College was kind of based off of that, and it was based on the idea that you'd have one for each senator or one for each representative. And that means that, again, the voters in the small states end up having a lot more influence on presidential elections than the voters in the big states. So if you look on the screen here, you see that under the Constitution, they actually created a number of electoral votes initially until they could complete the first census. Then the first census came along in 1790, and that's when these first states were actually allocated purely based on the actual population according to the census. Uh, but here you see you have small states. Delaware only had one House seat, and big states. Pennsylvania had 13, New York had 10, North Carolina had 10, Massachusetts had 14. So these little states like Delaware and Georgia and Rhode Island, they were afraid they're going to get completely trampled. So that was the compromise to get them to actually join the Union, was to give them that extra power in the Senate and the extra power in the Electoral College. Uh, Today, of course, we have more than 13 states. We can turn them all back on here. And if we come over to the 2020 census, we still see places like Alaska that have one. Delaware is one seat. Hawaii's two seats. But we also see places like California with 52 seats, 52 times more votes than Alaska, but still two senators. So a person living in Alaska has 52 times more Senate representation than a person living in California, and also has considerably more uh, electoral college representation for presidential votes. Now, this is why it's considered to be somewhat inappropriate by some people. If we look at the electoral votes here, Alaska is three electoral votes compared to 54 votes for California. So obviously, there's a lot more Senate representation per person, a lot more electoral college representation per person, a lot more presidential representation per person. So we can actually look at how much this has changed. If we look at people per electoral vote, we have 244,464 in Alaska. So this is 244,464 people get one electoral vote, compared to uh, Florida, where it's 717,940 people. You'll notice these don't exactly match the same ratio of House seats, and that's because you throw the Senate seats in and things do vary a little bit. Plus, the smaller states, uh, a lot of times they are really only entitled to a small fraction of a House seat, but they get a whole House seat. But rounding causes these differences. You have a number of them here that are like 600s. So there's 650, there's a 671. So you can actually sort these. We sort by column Z. Oh, sorry about the standard deviation. The minimum is Wyoming, which is 192,000 people per electoral college vote, compared to California at 732,000. So seven times the representation, roughly. So this is a problem in the view of many. It's certainly not a strictly democratic process where one person, one vote. And as you remember from the first sheet that we looked at, it's caused some problems. We have three cases where the winner of the popular vote lost, and actually there was a fourth uh, where the winner of the popular vote was the winner of the electoral vote and still lost. because they didn't win the majority of the electoral vote. And per the Constitution, you have to have a majority of so you have to have more than half of the Electoral College votes in order to be declared president. Otherwise, it gets kicked over to the House to figure out what to do with it. And there have been two cases where it was kicked to the House. So, is the system perfect? Well, we have three cases here where you had somebody with a majority of electoral college votes, less, did not win the popular vote out of 59, which is about 5%. When you throw in those other two cases where the person who had the most popular vote did not end up winning, uh, you're looking at about 8% of US presidential elections where the person with the most votes lost. And that seems like a problem. So, why hasn't this been fixed yet? Well, part of the reason is that some states don't want it fixed. Small states, which tend to be rural states as well, uh, benefit greatly from this. They have a lot more political influence than the big states do, or that would be allowed to them based purely on their population. If we look at the variance of number of people compared per electoral college vote compared to average, you get places like Wyoming. Uh, there's 332,488 less people per electoral college vote than average nationwide. Um, they have a lot more influence. They're way oversized. But as you go through, we have Vermont and Alaska and North Dakota and Montana and Rhode Island and South Dakota, Delaware. You've got to get all the way down here to Oregon. Well, I guess it's the 21st most populous state before you start to have people a situation where you have less representation. In this case, a negative number in this means that you have less people per representative, so each person has more representation. Uh, and you get up here, you get up to Texas, California, New York, you're looking at a couple 100,000 more people per electoral college vote. So, there's definitely some non-representative numbers here. So, when you go to look at what you would need to do to fix it, well, fixing it's not easy. It's a constitutional amendment. Constitutional amendments required, probably. We'll talk about a way around that in a bit here. But first, you have to decide, is it broken? And a lot of these smaller states, a lot of these states that have oversized representation, would say, no, this isn't broken. Even some of the bigger states that align more with rural views than urban views, they don't think it's broken. So, although the majority of the population may think it's broken, that's not enough to do it. So you might wonder, has the problem been getting worse? And well, we can look at that and we can determine objectively, is this actually getting worse? The fact that we've had two very recent presidential elections that the popular vote uh, getter did not, in fact, win the election because of the electoral college vote being different might indicate that it's worse. Although let's look at the state by state variance. Uh, so what you're looking at here is the standard deviation difference, which is just how far from the average you are relative to the population. So if you look at somebody like Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and New Jersey, they're really close. You look at some other states like Rhode Island, uh, they were a lot smaller. Virginia's way up, uh, but it's by 1.6, 1.4 standard deviations. So let's just change this and bring up all the current stuff here. What do we have currently? Well, let's sort this and look at the most recent census here. So we have Wyoming, which is negative 2.2. That's a little worse. We were at 1.6, 1.7 before. And we've got four states that are above 1.7, the smallest states. On the bigger side, really, that's not that much different. So, objectively speaking, the when you look at like standard deviations away from the average, the problem hasn't really gotten much worse. Uh, so why are we having the differences? Well, that can come down to a few things. States do change from election to election. I live in Michigan, a state that has fairly routinely switched presidential votes between Democratic and Republican back and forth. So that's part of what's going on here. Uh, Apparently, there are national changes, but it looks like this hasn't really changed that much, but maybe it's becoming more of an issue now. So let's look at possible solutions to the problem. And the first solution is to do absolutely nothing. The small states, very happy with what's going on here with the Electoral College. Some of the mid-size and larger states that tend to align more with some of the smaller, more rural states, they're okay with it too. Places like Texas are okay with it. Uh, so that's an option. That's always an option, is to do absolutely nothing about it. If you wanted to change it, the way to change it, there are several ways to go about doing it. Uh, First method is a constitutional amendment. In the US, these are very difficult to do, especially if you don't have strong political consensus. The most common way that it happens is for the both the House and Senate to have a two-thirds vote, two-thirds majority vote in favor of the amendment. They then pass it to the states, and the states then have to either have their legislatures or a state convention have to ratify it for three-quarters of the states. Uh, the second method is that two-thirds of the states petition the federal legislature for a constitutional convention to draft the amendment. Uh, they draft the amendment. The U.S. legislature is cut out of the deal, and then still three-quarters of all states, either the legislatures or a state convention, have to ratify it. The difference between the legislatures ratifying it and a state convention ratifying it is that when the legislatures ratify it, well, we all know what those are. It's their House and Senate or whatever their equivalents are. A state convention is a way to cut the state legislatures out of the deal. Uh, Now, that has only happened once, and that was to repeal prohibition. As far as the option of the states petitioning the government to call a constitutional convention, that has never successfully happened. There are regularly votes in different legislatures around the country to do this. However, you have to have a vote for the same topic in every state or in two-thirds of the states for it to happen, and that is what has not yet happened. Uh, a third option is to redraw the state lines, uh, and that would give you the ability to kind of shuffle population a little bit better, so that your states are a little bit closer in population or in demographics or in something, uh, as opposed to the way they're drawn today. So let's look at the second option here, the constitutional amendment, uh, with Congress initiating it. Uh, can you imagine the current or any recent US Congress passing anything with a two-thirds majority in both the House and Senate? Uh, I can't imagine that happening, to tell you the truth. Uh, the third option there, with the states calling for a constitutional convention, there too, uh, that's never happened successfully. There are increasing proposals in the state legislatures to call a constitutional convention on a variety of topics. They would all have to call for it on the same topic. That has never happened yet, although possibly it could happen in the future. Um, let's just take a quick look at what it would actually take to block that. So if we come here, we have the percent of population, and we know that we need uh, three-quarters of all the states to ratify it, one way or another, either through the convention or through the state legislatures. With 50 states, that means we need 13 states to block an amendment. Well, let's come down here to 13 states. We'll column one as the heading here. So, uh, 13 states. We need, well, this is state number 13 here. 4.42% of the US population states can block a constitutional amendment. Uh, so that does mean that a very small, and those are all rural states, if you look. Well, actually, yeah, pretty much they're all fairly, they're small, mostly rural areas. Uh, they can block an amendment effectively. So the chances of an amendment getting through, probably not happening. So what about these other options? Well, we have redraw the state lines. Technically, that could happen. I don't see it happening. I haven't heard any calls for it. Uh, the last option, which is drawing some attention, is what's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And what this is a agreement between states. It's a legally binding agreement where you hold the presidential election just like you do today. Once enough states have ratified this compact and put it into their state law, at that point, those states are bound to always vote for the presidential candidate who had the most national popular vote, regardless of their own state vote. So this does not go into effect until they have enough states on board that it would actually constitute a majority of the electoral votes. So right now, quite a few states have ratified this, although there's not yet enough. So if we get some more states, especially if we get some other big states or larger states at least in on this, you could get to the point where a state ends up having 51% of its votes for one candidate, and they cast all of their electoral votes for the other candidate because that's who won the national popular vote. And that's the whole idea behind the national popular vote interstate compact, is to guarantee that whoever gets the most votes, that's the winner. So those are the options. Should it happen? Yeah, there are arguments for and against. As we saw, it hasn't really gotten substantially worse. It hasn't gotten any better. And we've had two elections fairly close together where the electoral vote was was the deciding factor and went against the popular vote. It's hard telling if that's a trend. That could just be a statistical anomaly. So, one data point means nothing, two don't mean much more. So I don't expect any big changes unless we keep seeing the electoral vote and the popular vote splitting as it did in 2016, as it did in 2000. If we start to see that happen more regularly, then I think you're going to see a lot more states jump into this national popular vote interstate compact, especially if it starts to impact both parties more adversely. So before we go on, I do want to say if you've learned anything from this video, please do like and subscribe, hit notify. That tells YouTube, show this to more people, puts it up on more people's screens so people can see it. It also tells YouTube creators like me, hey, this is something worth watching. By subscribing and hitting notify, you'll be notified when I release new videos. I try to release something new every week. I also have a Patreon page over at patreon.com/data analysis excellence. If you could help out there, that'd be great. It's just a few bucks a month. So anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, please do keep them non-political. Um, you know, focus on the numbers, focus on the procedures to change. Don't say this party's horrible, this party's great. I don't want to see that down there. I'll just kill the comments. Uh, so I look forward to seeing you again with my next video. Again, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.